as well as the pacemaker potential, and then how that conduction spreads. So the spread of excitation through the heart, and then what's happening as far as the ionic movement in the pacemaker cell to result in that spontaneous polarization. And then subsequently, the ionic movement in a contractile cell. So remember, contractile cells were not cells that could generate an action potential the way that pacemaker cells could, but they can receive the input via those gap junctions that we talked about, and then they can actually generate the contractile force of the chambers. So go over those two aspects if you haven't already. And then for objective 3 here, we're going to talk about identifying all phases of the cardiac cycle, understand origin of pressure, and describe the relationship between pressure and volume. So this is really looking at the cardiac cycle from a different perspective. We've talked about how the electrical activity moves from the SA node to the AV node, so the atria can contract and then relax, the ventricles can contract and then relax, and then blood can be ejected from both of those chambers at different points in that cycle. So here we're going to look at those same sets of events, just from a slightly different perspective. These events are called the cardiac cycle. So we'll speak about the phases of the cardiac cycle. We'll talk about how the atrial pressures and ventricular pressures are changing. We'll talk about the aortic pressure, and then we'll talk about the ventricular volume changes. The ventricles are the most important chambers as it applies to volume. These are the ejection chambers. And then lastly, we'll talk about how all of this applies to the two heart sounds. It's really important for us to begin the conversation by recalling the way that the valves behave and the way that the ventricles behave. So we mentioned that when blood moves from the atria to the ventricle, or from the ventricle out into that vessel, it is moving because of pressure changes. So the valves are not contractile. The valves are simply connective tissue that are closing because they are anchored to the papillary muscles of the ventricle. When the papillary muscle contracts, the valves are shut tight, but the valves in and of themselves are simply obeying the pressure gradient. So in order for blood to move through any of the 4 valves, the pressure in the chamber before has to be higher than the pressure in the chamber to which the blood is flowing. And that is the only way for us to get the valves to open. So bear that in mind as we talk about these different cycles, and understand that in order for a valve to open, the pressure in the preceding chamber has to be higher than the pressure in the subsequent chamber. So the cardiac cycle is essentially how the blood is flowing through the different chambers in a single heartbeat. So in a single heartbeat, there are 4 different events and 2 main periods that are sort of controlling how that blood is flowing. The first one is called systole, and systole is when the ventricles are contracting. This is also called ventricular ejection. Essentially, the ventricle pressure is rising, the muscle itself is contracting, and that is going to cause blood to be squeezed from the ventricle out into the exiting vessel, whether that be the aorta on the left side of the heart or the pulmonary artery on the right side of the heart. Diastole, which is ventricular relaxation, is when the ventricles are able to fill. So as the ventricle is filling, the valve that has to be open to accommodate that are the AV valves. So blood is moving from the atria down into the ventricle. As you would imagine here, the ventricles are relaxing, so they have lower pressure. The atria are contracting, so they have higher pressure, and that blood can be squeezed down into the ventricle. So there's systole, and then there's diastole. We'll talk about this coming up in a minute, but the heart spends a longer time in diastole just because the heart needs to have adequate time to fill in order to be able to eject effectively. And then at the bottom here, sort of going over that same concept that we just shared. The AV valves are open when the atrial pressure exceeds the ventricular pressure. The semilunar valves are open when the ventricular pressure exceeds the arterial pressure. So again, in order for any of the valves to open, the pressure in the chamber preceding the valve has to be higher than the pressure in the chamber or the vessel that is after that valve. So let's look at the first phase of the cardiac cycle here. And this is called ventricular filling. So this begins in the middle of ventricular diastole. Oops, I'm sorry. What did I do? Okay. Here we go. So this is essentially looking at the chambers and how filling is taking place. And then down here, we're looking at how the pressure is changing and how the volume is changing. And then later on, we'll connect this to what's happening with the heart sounds. So ventricular filling starts in the middle of ventricular diastole. In other words, in the middle of that period when the ventricle is filling, it's relaxed and it's filling. What's happening here is the blood that came back to the right atrium or left atrium, which we call the venous return, when those veins dump blood back into the atria. So if we're looking at our schematic here, these would be our atrial chambers. The AV valves would be open, so that's going to be our tricuspid on the right and our bicuspid or mitral on the left. And then blood is actively moving from the atria down into the ventricle. Here, the semilunar valves are going to be closed, right? Because remember, we can't have all four valves open. There's no singular phase or period where all four of the heart valves are open. That just wouldn't be efficient as far as the action of the chambers, as well as the electrical events. We know for a fact that the atrium must contract and then relax, and then the ventricles will contract and relax. So there's never a time when all four of the heart valves are open. So because in this phase, the AV valves are open so that the ventricles can fill, at the same time, the semilunar valves must be closed. This is going to begin as a passive process. In other words, initially, when that pressure in the atria rise, the AV valve opens, blood begins to fill down into the ventricle. That starts as a passive process. Towards the end of ventricular filling, the atria will contract, right? So the blood will just spill passively at the initial part of this phase, but then towards the end of this phase, the atria is going to contract just a little in an attempt to get that last bit of blood out as the AV valves will then close. So this begins as a passive process, but then towards the end, the atria will contract in order to squeeze that last bit out. So that will make sense as far as our pressure changes here. So notice that the pressure is slightly rising in the atria, and then it is going to rise even higher just towards the end as the atria contracts at the end of that phase. The AV valves will be open, the semilunar valves will be closed, and then this will be the ventricular filling stage. The second phase is called isovolumetric ventricular contraction, and the word isovolumetric is very important here. Isovolumetric means the volume stays the same. So iso same, volumetric is the volume. And what this means is that blood is not necessarily moving in any direction because the volume is staying the same. What's happening here is the AV valves have closed. This is the beginning of systole. The ventricles are going to start contracting here as the pressure in the ventricles rise, and then the AV and semilunar valves are still closed. So both valves are closed. The AV valves are closed, semilunar valves are closed, and it's a very short period between the time that the ventricular pressure is rising. Remember that we said in order for blood to move and the valve to open, the pressure in the preceding chamber has to exceed the pressure in the next chamber. So during this phase, the pressure in the ventricle has risen to where it's no longer less than the pressure in the atria. So the AV valves are closed, but it is not yet high enough to where it is now greater than the pressure in the vessels. So both of the valves are going to be closed in this very short period, but the ventricular pressure will be rising as the ventricle begins to contract. So we can see that happening here. Notice all four valves are closed. Notice that it's a much shorter phase as well. Also, we can see that the ventricular pressure is steeply rising, so that's the green curve here. Atrial pressure begins to drop off as that AV valve closes. And then if we look at the volume change is staying the same. So it rose, and the volume change here is representing what's in the ventricle. So it's going to rise in that initial phase of ventricular filling, and ventricular filling. And then in the isovolumetric phase, the volume curve or the volume line is flat because none of the valves are open and the volume is not changing. The third phase is ventricular ejection. Here is where the pressure is now high enough, right? So in that previous phase, the pressure was rising. It was not high enough to where it was greater than the pressure in the pulmonary artery or even in the aorta. So the semilunar valve was still closed. In the ventricular ejection phase, the pressure is now high enough in the ventricle to where the semilunar valves will open because the pressure in the ventricle is now higher than the pressure in the arteries. And then the ventricular pressure is now less than the aortic pressure. And so it's going to squeeze that blood out. Okay, here toward the end of this phase, the ventricular pressure drops off. And the reason ventricular pressure drops off is because the blood is leaving the chamber. So at the beginning of this phase, and you can see that in the pressure here, pressure is rising high. The semilunar valves now open. Blood will leave the chamber as the valve opens. But as the blood leaves the chamber, that pressure will naturally fall. And then that's going to cause the semilunar valves to close immediately after that point. So notice the ventricular pressure here rises steeply at the beginning of the ventricular ejection and then drops off towards the end of ventricular ejection. The AV valves are still closed here. The semilunar valves are now open. The atrial pressure is low because those AV valves are closed. And then if we look at the volume drops off because blood is leaving the ventricle and moving out into the arteries. The fourth and final phase, this is going to bring us right back to the middle of diastole, right? Remember, we started in the middle of diastole, and we're going to come back to that middle of diastole as we end the fourth phase. This is called the isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. And again, the word isovolumetric here is really important because this tells us one thing. Both of the valves are closed. The AV valves are closed. The semilunar valves are closed, and so volume is not moving. Blood is not moving or leaving the ventricle. And so here we have when the ventricles start to relax, the pressure in the ventricle is going to decrease. Both of the valves are closed, and then we're going to bring it back down to the first phase once again. So here we're trying to get back to the first phase, which is that ventricular filling. But what has to happen is the pressure in the ventricle has to come back down to where it is lower than the pressure in the atria in order for those AV valves to open up once again. So in the ventricular relaxation, the isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, the pressure is dropping in order to get to a point to where the AV valves can open because the ventricular pressure is once again lower than the atrial pressure, and then those AV valves would naturally open up. So if we look at our curve here, once again, this is going to be a very short phase, as you can see in terms of the time. All four of the valves are closed, right, which is that blue in both of the boxes here. The ventricular pressure is steeply dropping off, as we can see here, because now the chamber is relaxing. Atrial pressure is going to start to rise again, getting ready for that next cycle, which is phase one again. And then if we look at the volume is the same. So both in the isovolumetric ventricular contraction, which is this spot, and the isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, in both of those phases, the volume is the same. And so it's going to be a flat line on the volume curve. What is also happening if we look at the aortic pressure is the pressure specifically on the left side of the heart. This is the pressure in the aorta. And as we can see, when the semilunar valves close at the end of ventricular ejection and at the beginning of isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, the aortic pressure is going to rise slightly. And that is as a result of the blood that is moving out into the aorta, hitting at the back of those closing semilunar valves. So as the semilunar valves close in between phase 3 and phase 4, when that last bit of blood that has left the ventricle hits against the back of the closing valves, that causes a spike in the aortic pressure, which is what we see here. Right? Okay, so here's just a comprehensive overview. We start in phase 1, which is mid to late diastole. This is where the ventricles are filling. The AV valves are open. Towards the end of that, we have a slight bit of atrial contraction. Then we move into isovolumetric relaxation. All 4 valves are closed. Volume is moving, or blood is moving in no direction, therefore volume is not changing. The ventricle is simply contracting in order to raise that pressure to overcome the pressure in the arteries. That is going to be the first part of systole. Then we move into ventricular ejection, which is the third phase. This is where the pressure in the ventricle is now high enough. We can see the pressure and the volume changing. So as blood is leaving the ventricle, the pressure is dropping off to where, when it drops lower than the pressure in the artery, those semilunar valves will close once again. That will bring us to isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, which is where the pressure is slowly dropping off to where it is now lower than the pressure in the atria, and that will trigger the opening up of the AV valves, which is going to result in the beginning of diastole, which is our ventricular filling once again. So those are the events of the cardiac cycle. And so that is how blood is moving through each of the chambers as a result of the pressure change. And so the pressure and the volume will be changing in each of those cycles. Okay, I'm going to pause here and see if we have questions on that bit. Okay, at this point, what we're going to do is speak about those same events. We're just going to talk about them in a different way to highlight what's happening in the atria, as well as what's happening in the ventricle, and then also what's happening in the aorta. So the aorta is a really important vessel. It tells us a lot about our overall vascular health and the health of the heart. And so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how the pressure in the aorta changes as well. So starting here again with phase 1, where we have the atrial pressure rising, blood is leaving the atria and moving down into the ventricle. The ventricular pressure is low, as we can see here. So relative to what the max ventricular pressure will be, ventricular pressure is low. Atrial pressure is high, but again, that's relative to the pressures that are in the atria. The small rise in the ventricular pressure at the end of the first phase here is really owed to that atria squeezing the last bit of blood out as the AV valves will then close. So here we have the start of atrial contraction, and then we have the start of ventricular contraction, both of these in an attempt to encourage the last bit of blood to leave the atria, move down into the ventricle, and then after that point, the AV valves will then close. Phase 2 is the rapid rise in the ventricular pressure, while we're also seeing the atrial pressure drop off. So this is the isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Notice how the green curve is steeply rising, which tells us that the pressure in the ventricle is also steeply rising, but it is not low enough for the AV valves to be open, and it is also not high enough for the semilunar valves to be open just yet. This is going to be the start of the ventricles contracting. Phase 3, the ventricular pressure will now begin to fall. So at the beginning of this phase, ventricular pressure is high, but as the blood leaves the chamber, as it is being ejected out into the arteries, then eventually ventricular pressure will drop off. That will encourage or trigger the closure of the semilunar valves. Okay. which is going to be the closure of the semilunar valves here. And then in our fourth and final phase, which is the ventricular ejection, blood will leave the ventricle, pressure will steeply drop off, as will the volume, and then we're going to get back down, or not the volume, excuse me. So this is isovolumetric. So volume is not changing here, only the pressure dropping off, and then we're going to get back to phase one, which is that ventricular filling again. Okay. If we look at diastole, so diastole is basically the time the heart spends filling. And this is essentially the end of the fourth phase, but also the beginning of the first phase. And this is going to be the longest part of the cardiac cycle. So as I mentioned earlier, the heart is going to spend more time filling, where blood is going to be entering, or the ventricle is relaxing, blood is going to be entering the chamber. Here we have the aortic valves closing, right? They've just begun to close. And then it's going to give us the lowest point in that diastolic pressure. All right. So if we think about the lowest point in diastolic pressure, that's going to be the end of, here we go, the end of the phase three, really getting into the beginning of phase four, where the blood is now leaving the aorta, pressure dropping off, and then it can move out into the vessel after that point. Okay, systole, on the other hand, is where the aortic valves are now going to be open. So semilunar valves are open. Pressure is high at the beginning. So pressure is going to be high at the beginning, but then it's going to drop off as blood leaves that chamber. At the end of that phase, systolic valve or aortic valves will then close, and that will trigger the bump here in the aortic pressure. So this is what we call the dichotic notch. So at the end of that ventricular ejection, when that last bit of blood hits the back of the closing semilunar valves, that triggers the dichotic notch, which is that slight bump in the aortic pressure at the end of that ventricular ejection. So this central phase here, phase 2 and phase 3, correspond with systole, whereas the outer phases, phase 4 and phase 1, are going to correspond with diastole. All right, let's talk about the mean arterial pressure. The mean arterial pressure is the average pressure throughout the entire cardiac cycle. So if you were to look at the pressure in the aorta, this is again why we want to focus in on the aorta. It's such an important vessel to tell us about the health of the heart, the health of the left ventricle, but also the health of our systemic circulation. So the mean arterial pressure is if we were to take the average pressure in the aorta that's happening throughout the entire cardiac cycle. And what it tells us is the measure of the force with which blood is being pushed throughout the entire systemic circulation. And so that tells us two things. It tells us how healthy that left ventricle is, but it also tells us what type of resistance is being encountered in the systemic vasculature, right, in our systemic vessels. And so it's going to be the continuous blood flowing through the entire cardiac cycle. It's going to give us a good picture about the continuous blood flow throughout the entire cardiac cycle. This is because the aorta is one of our large elastic arteries. The aorta will also serve as a pressure reservoir. We'll talk about how that elastic nature of that vessel can capture pressure and store that pressure to be expelled throughout other parts of the cycle. So it's going to store that pressure in the walls of the vessel during systole. Remember, systole is ventricular ejection. Blood is leaving the ventricle, it's moving out into the arteries. And so during that time, the arteries are going to expand. And as they expand, because they're so elastic, specifically the aorta, it's going to capture some of that pressure. Think about you pulling back a slingshot, right? You're going to pull back that slingshot. And so you're capturing pressure here, which can then be used to release as a recoil mechanism to propel blood forward. So that type of mechanism is happening in the aorta because it's such a large artery and because it has such good elastic properties. It can capture energy or pressure in systole and then release that energy in diastole. As a result of this, this is going to keep the blood flow through the cardiac cycle continuous. So during systole, blood will be flowing with force through the cardiac cycle out into the systemic vasculature. But then also during diastole, that released pressure, right, that captured pressure in the aortic wall will be released. And so that's going to keep the blood continuously flowing in both of our cardiac events, in both systole and diastole. All right. So here is an image to illustrate that idea. So we've got systole here. Blood is flowing during systole from the left ventricle through the aortic valve out into the aorta. Notice the way that the aorta is expanding. Right? Notice the direction of the arrows, which is showing us the vessel is expanding. Because it is so elastic, it's going to capture that pressure in the walls. And then we're going to have flow to the systemic organs during the systolic phase. During diastole, when the aortic valves close, that captured pressure is now going to be released as a form of elastic recoil, and that will continue to force or propel blood moving forward, although the aortic valve is closed at this point. What this does is it allows for there to be continuous amount and pressure of flow of that blood out to our systemic organs that is the same in systole as it is in diastole. And so that allows continuous blood flow, and it prevents any interruption in the pressure or interruption in the flow that is moving out to the systemic organs.